Dennis, of course, noticed the slight pause, the tiny flicker of disdain in her eyes. He had seen it all before, people making judgments based solely on the way someone looked, on the way they dressed, or on their perceived status. But Dennis didn't flinch. He was used to this treatment. He had long ago learned to wear his anonymity like armor. "Can I help you?" Brandy's voice was cool, almost condescending. As she glanced at him, clearly unsure of whether he belonged in the same space as the wealthy elites who frequented HENIX, Dennis remained calm, his tone polite. "I have a reservation under Lowry." Brandy's eyes narrowed slightly as she scanned the reservation list. "Are you sure?" she asked, emphasizing the words high-end with a hint of mockery, as though she believed Dennis had mistakenly wandered into the wrong restaurant. It was a subtle but effective form of exclusion. It was as if she was telling him, without saying it outright, that people like him didn't belong here. Dennis, however, didn't rise to the bait. He simply nodded, his voice steady. "Yes, I'm sure. The reservation is under Lowry." Brandy continued scanning the list, her fingers skimming over the names until she landed on Lowry. She pursed her lips, a slight sigh escaping her as she looked up at him with barely contained disappointment. "Fine," she said, waving her hand dismissively toward a small, crumped table near the kitchen. "You can sit over there." Dennis noticed immediately that this was not an innocent mistake. The prime seats by the windows, with their sweeping views of the New York skyline, were reserved for those who were deemed worthy. The rich, the famous, the influential, and Dennis, as it turned out, was none of those things, at least not in Brandy's eyes. But Dennis wasn't fazed. He knew exactly what this moment meant. With a faint, knowing smile, he nodded. "Thank you," he said, his voice calm. He made his way to the table, taking his seat without complaint. The small table was located just outside the kitchen, far from the luxurious seating areas where the real VIPs were placed. From his vantage point, he could see the entire restaurant, polished floors, the gleaming chandeliers, the rich red velvet curtains that framed the windows. The atmosphere was undeniably beautiful. Every table was set with crystal glasses, gleaming silverware, and fresh flowers. The soft strains of jazz music filled the air, creating an ambience of elegance and sophistication. The waitstaff moved smoothly between the tables, their white shirts and black ties crisp and immaculate. Everything seemed perfect. But as Dennis settled into his seat, he couldn't help but notice something that wasn't quite right. There was a subtle tension in the air. Despite the glamour and luxury surrounding him, something felt off. He could see it in the faces of the other diners, those who were part of the elite crowd, the smiles that seemed a little too forced, the laughter that didn't quite reach their eyes. The staff moved with practiced precision, but there was an undercurrent of anxiety that Dennis could feel in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't just the food that mattered here, it was the perception of being seen, of being treated as special. And Dennis, sitting in his small corner near the kitchen, felt anything but special. Minutes ticked by. Dennis perused the menu, reading through the dishes that promised to be a feast for the sensitive scallops. Truffle risotto, roasted duck, foie gras, but despite the luxurious offerings, his attention drifted. The sounds of the kitchen staff at work, the clatter of pots and pans, the hurried footsteps of waiters as they rushed to serve other tables, these things became a constant reminder of his less than ideal seating. He couldn't focus on the ambience when there were so many distractions. This was supposed to be an exclusive experience, but in this moment, it felt more like a performancier show put on for those who mattered, while people like him were left to observe from the sidelines. And then Brandy returned. She placed the menu in front of him with a swift, careless motion, barely meeting his eyes. "There you go," she said curtly, her voice indifferent as she turned away to attend to the wealthier patrons. Dennis could already sense the difference in treatment. The couple seated near the windows, dressed in designer clothes and dripping with wealth, was greeted with warmth. Brandy smiled brightly at them, engaging in light conversation, laughing at their jokes, offering recommendations with genuine enthusiasm. She made sure they felt comfortable, special. But when it came to Dennis, she barely gave him a second glance. Brandy's behavior was subtle, but it was unmistakable. She was treating him as though he didn't belong here, as though he were invisible. He raised his hand to get her attention, but she was too busy entertaining the wealthy guests to notice him. Every now and then, She would glance his way, but she made no effort to serve him. With the same care or respect she afforded the other diners. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Brandy returned. Her face was sour, her patience clearly wearing thin. She tapped her pen against her notepad, an impatient gesture that made it clear she was not interested in dealing with him. The Night That Changed Everything at HENIX Restaurant, by Dennis Lowry, The Untold Story. It was a crisp autumn evening in New York City. The hustle of Fifth Avenue felt more alive than ever. The streets were lit by the soft glow of street lamps, their light reflecting of the polished glass windows of luxury boutiques and towering skyscrapers. Pedestrians hurried along, their coats drawn tight against the chill, their steps quick and purposeful. The city that never slept was just starting to awaken as the night life of the wealthy and the famous began to stir. Among the crowd, one figure stood out, though not for the reasons one might expect. Dennis Lowry, impeccably dressed in a navy blue tailored suit, moved with a quiet confidence, his polished leather shoes gleaming under the streetlights. From a distance, one could easily mistake him for just another businessman rushing to an important meeting. He blended effortlessly with the crowd of professionals who filled the streets, walking with a sense of purpose toward an exclusive destination. But Dennis was not just any businessman. He was one of New York's most respected and feared restaurant critics. His name carried weight in the culinary world. Every restaurant he reviewed felt the pressure. His sharp insights were renowned for being brutally honest, sometimes to the point of ruthless. He had built his reputation on one key principle: anonymity. Unlike many critics who flaunted their status and often received special treatment, Dennis preferred to experience the restaurant as any other patron would. He visited restaurants under a false name, never revealing his identity, and evaluated every aspect of the dining experience, from the food to the service to how he was treated by the staff. This allowed him to capture the true essence of the restaurant, unobstructed by preferential treatment or biases. Tonight, Dennis had a reservation at one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, HENIX, a place renowned for its exquisite ambience and its gourmet menu that boasted the finest ingredients. It was a hotspot for celebrities, CEOs, socialites, and influencers. Dining here was a symbol of status. But tonight, Dennis wasn't there for the reputation. He was there to do his job, to assess the food, the service, and the experience as he always did. And as always, he would do so without anyone knowing who he truly was. As Dennis approached the entrance of HENIX, he was greeted by a tall, blonde woman with sharp features and a forced smile. Her name tag read Brandy. She was the head waitress, a woman known for her strict demeanor and her tendency to judge patrons based on appearance. As she looked him up and down, her eyes briefly narrowed, clearly assessing his worth before deciding how to treat him. "What'll it be?" she asked, barely disguising her irritation. Dennis remained calm, ordering the filet mignon, medium rare, with a side of truffle mashed potatoes. His voice was even, betraying none of the frustration he felt. He had seen this kind of treatment before. He knew exactly how the night would unfold. Brandy scribbled down his order and hurried off, leaving Dennis to sit in his small corner, observing the room around him. The contrast between the attention heaped on the wealthy guests and the neglect he was experiencing could not have been more stark. And as the minutes stretched on, Dennis's thoughts were clear. This was not just a bad dining experience. This was a reflection of how some restaurants treated their patrons, based on superficial judgments based on who they were, what they wore, and how much they could spend. The evening dragged on. Plates of gourmet dishes were brought to every table around him, plates of roasted lamb, seared duck, creamy risotto. But his meal was nowhere to be seen. 30 minutes passed, then 40. Still, no food. Dennis didn't say anything. He simply sat back, observing. Brandy continued to flit between the tables of the wealthy guests, her smile bright and her demeanor charming. But when it came to Dennis, she barely acknowledged his existence. The disparity in service was glaring. The other diners were treated like royalty, while Dennis remained invisible. After nearly an hour, Brandy finally appeared with Dennis's meal. She placed a overcooked filet mignon in front of him with a clumsy thud, barely making eye contact. The steak was tough and dry, far from the tender, juicy cut he had expected. The truffle mashed potatoes, once the highlight of his order, were cold and lumpy, as though they had been sitting out for far too long. Dennis didn't react outwardly. He simply observed. His years of experience had taught him that this was exactly the kind of thing that would eventually come back to haunt them. The restaurant's veneer of perfection had cracked, and Dennis was the one to see it, and he would not forget it. The story continues to unfold, with Dennis ultimately revealing the truth behind HENIX's deception, and how his review became a turning point for both the restaurant and Brandy's future. The power of Dennis's critical voice becomes a lesson in humility for the restaurant industry, reminding us all that appearances can be deceiving, and the most powerful critics may not always be who they seem.